He grabbed her wrist and twisted it, the way a man does, when he has decided that your refusal is not a real refusal, just an obstacle. And the woman at the corner booth looked at his hand with the particular stillness of someone running a very fast calculation. The calculation took approximately 1.5 seconds. Staff Sergeant Dylan Strickland went face down on the table with his arm leveraged behind him, at an angle his elbow was not designed to accommodate, and the entire back section of the Brickyard Bar and Grill in Fayetteville, North Carolina, went dead quiet. Not the polite quiet of people trying not to stare, the other kind. The kind where 30 adults hold their breath simultaneously because something has just happened that none of their experience has prepared them for. The woman released his wrist. She stepped back 1 step. She straightened the collar of her flannel shirt. Then she sat back down and picked up her coffee. Her name was Ingram, and she had driven 40 minutes from her apartment in Raleigh, specifically to be in a place where nobody knew her name. She had chosen Fayetteville the way some people choose dentists, not because it was pleasant, but because it was familiar. She'd spent 8 of her 14 years in the Army cycling in and out of installations near Fort Bragg, and the specific quality of a military town on a Friday night had a kind of ugly comfort to it. The noise was the right frequency. The silence, when it came, meant something she understood. She was 36 years old and had separated from the Army 11 days ago. 11 days. She hadn't fully counted them before tonight, but sitting in the corner booth with a coffee going cold and the remnants of a club sandwich she hadn't finished, the numbers surfaced clearly. 11 days since she'd handed in her access badge. 11 days of an apartment that felt like it was trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. She hadn't come to the Brickyard to drink. She didn't do that anymore. Not since Kandahar. Not since the particular Tuesday that had made her understand what she was capable of reaching for when the alternative was being alone with her own head. She'd come for the noise, the jukebox, the pool table arguments, the low-grade chaos of off-duty soldiers pretending to be civilians for one night. She understood all of it. It required nothing from her. The group of 82nd Airborne men in the back had been there since before she arrived. 7 or 8 of them, she'd clocked them immediately, the particular posture of paratroopers, chest forward and loose-limbed at once, the tendency to take up more room than necessary. They were loud in the way men are loud when they feel safe. She had nothing against any of them. She'd worked alongside 82nd personnel, an environment she would never be permitted to describe in a bar or anywhere else. She simply had no energy for them tonight. She turned her coffee cup in both hands and looked at nothing. The approach came at 9:14, though she wasn't watching the clock. She heard it, the particular rhythm of confident footsteps, the scrape of the bench opposite her. "You've been sitting here by yourself for over an hour." The voice was genial, the kind of genial that expects a specific return. "That's a waste." She didn't look up. "I'm good. Company's free." So's solitude. A pause. Behind him she heard the low commentary of his table. Something encouraging, something that functioned as permission. The presence of an audience had always been the variable that mattered most in these situations. It wasn't about her. It never was. "Come on," he shifted closer. "I'm just being friendly." "I know," she kept her voice level, not cold, not warm. "Flat, the way you speak to someone you are being honest with. I'd rather be left alone." The temperature of the booth changed. She'd felt it before. That particular shift, the moment when a man's social script runs out and something older and less managed takes over. She knew what was coming. She'd given him 4 clear off-ramps and watched him drive past each one. "You know what your problem is?" His voice had a new edge, still smiling, but wrong underneath it. "You think being unfriendly makes you interesting." She looked at him for the first time. Full eye contact, no expression. "Please go back to your table." He stood, said something to his friends loud enough to carry, and she thought that was the end of it. That was the moment reasonable men chose to perform a graceful retreat. Strickland wasn't in a reasonable mood. He'd had 3 drinks and an audience, and a woman who had looked at him the way you look at a problem you've already solved. He reached down and grabbed her wrist. The grip was hard, genuinely hard, the kind that leaves marks. He pulled upward with the intention of bringing her to her feet. What happened next lasted less than 2 seconds and would take the men at his table considerably longer to process. Ingram didn't resist the upward pull. She redirected it, a slight angular adjustment, her body pivoting with the momentum rather than against it, her free hand finding the pressure point along the inside of his elbow with a precision that did not announce itself before it arrived. His face registered surprise before pain, which meant the pain was coming fast. His weight shifted forward involuntarily. The table caught most of him. His face and the wooden surface made a sound that carried to the front of the bar. She maintained the joint lock for exactly as long as it took to be certain he understood it was a choice on her part that he was still functioning. Then she let go. Strickland lifted his head from the table slowly. His arm was screaming. His pride was somewhere further south than he could currently locate. One of his men, Novak, big, broad, with the quiet face of someone whose instincts had always outpaced his impulses, was already on his feet. He stopped when she looked at him, not because he was afraid, because something about the quality of her attention, that flat patient readiness, communicated clearly that his threat assessment was working correctly and recommending strongly against forward movement. She reached into the breast pocket of her flannel shirt, set something on the table, a coin, heavy, matte finish, slightly larger than a quarter, an eagle over a globe, a designation along the reverse edge that Novak, from 8 feet away, could not fully read in the brickyard's low light. She left it there. She settled the tab with Taft, the retired SF warrant officer who'd owned the brickyard for 11 years and who had, without saying anything to anyone, taken 3 steps back from the register when the booth situation developed. She left 20%. She pulled her jacket off the hook beside the booth and walked out into the January cold without looking back. The parking lot held her truck and a dusting of ice on the windshield that hadn't been there when she arrived. She sat in the driver's seat and gripped the wheel and breathed the way she'd taught herself to breathe. 4 counts in, 2 hold, 6 out. The regulation pattern. The one she defaulted to when the alternative was defaulting to something worse. Her wrist had a bruise forming. She could feel it through the cold. She hadn't wanted a confrontation tonight. She had specifically driven 40 minutes to prevent one. She'd been clear. She had offered every reasonable exit. And she was not sorry, which was a different thing from being glad. She started the truck and drove south into the dark. Behind her, at the corner booth, Novak picked up the coin she'd left. He turned it over. His face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Recognition, then something more complex than recognition. Then the particular stillness of a man revising an assessment he'd already committed to. He looked at Strickland, who was upright again, and rubbing his wrist with the expression of someone whose internal narrative about the last 3 minutes required significant revision. "You need to see this," Novak said. "What is it?" Novak set the coin on the table, face up. "That designation," he said quietly, "corresponds to a unit I cannot find any public information on, because there isn't any." A pause. "Get some sleep. We need to talk about tonight before tomorrow finds us first." They got the orders at 0600. Every member of Strickland's squad, mandatory joint training assessment, classified facility outside Fayetteville, reporting time 0800, instructor TBD. Novak read it twice. He put his phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling until the alarm went off. He already knew. The facility was one of those places that exists on no public-facing map and has a gate staffed by people who don't waste energy on pleasantries. The receiving officer was a colonel named Spence, who delivered the situation brief in 11 words. Joint training assessment. 5 days. Your instructor will be here momentarily. Then the side door opened. Ingram walked in wearing tactical blacks and carrying a battered notebook, and the air in the room changed so completely and so fast that 2 men from Strickland's squad made sounds they would deny making for the rest of their careers. The bruise on her wrist was visible. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them, each of them, not lingering, not performing, just the even inventory of a person deciding how much of a problem something represents. "Yesterday," she said, "you made an assumption about what kind of person you were dealing with." A pause. "That is your first lesson. Assumptions in operational environments cost lives, not theoretically, specifically. I have stood at a grave because the people around me made an assumption about what the situation was and never looked hard enough at what it actually was." She set her notebook on the table. "My name is Ingram. I completed 14 years with the Army, the last 7 attached to a direct action element I cannot name in this room. I have operated in 6 countries, 4 of which I am not authorized to confirm in this space. I have completed missions that are still classified and will remain so until after everyone in this room has retired. She looked at Strickland directly. Not longer than she looked at anyone else, just clean and even. I am not here to humiliate you. I want to be clear about that, because the next 5 days will feel like humiliation. That is not its purpose. She picked up her notebook. Its purpose is to show you what you don't know. Because what you don't know right now would get you and every person beside you killed inside 60 seconds of real contact. Staff Sergeant Strickland. He straightened. Do you believe me? The word came out different than he'd intended. Yes, ma'am. She nodded once. Then let's begin. What followed over the next 4 days was the most systematically precise dismantling any of them had experienced in a training environment, and they had a substantial, combined history with being dismantled. Each day, Ingram found the specific gap in each man's operating pattern, not the gap in his technique, but the gap in his thinking. The exact moment where assumption replaced assessment, the exact moment where ego entered the decision and changed its geometry. She never announced the gap. She asked a question that forced the man to find it himself, which was, as several of them came to understand only in retrospect, far more damaging to the ego and far more useful to the soldier. By day 3, Strickland had stopped trying to find the ceiling of her capability and started trying to understand the architecture of her method. Novak noticed the shift first. The particular quality of Strickland's attention during the debriefs had moved from defensive to something more like a man who has encountered a genuinely interesting problem and cannot stop working it. On the evening of day 3, Ingram sat at the front of the empty briefing room after dinner and said, "Today we talk about what breaks you." She told them about Wilder. Sergeant First Class Aaron Wilder had been her partner through 6 years and 4 deployments. She knew his breathing pattern at elevation, his decision rhythm under sustained contact, the specific way he went quiet when he was scared, versus when he was simply thinking hard. He was from Bozeman, Montana. He had a daughter named Lily, who would be 7 years old now. He drank instant coffee that tasted like hot water with ambitions, and had never once apologized for it. He could identify any rifle caliber by the sound of the report alone, and had won $100 from a Marine, doing exactly that, which he considered among his finest professional achievements. She told it without drama. That was what landed hardest, not the story itself, though the story was devastating in the clean, factual way of things that actually happened. The ambush in the Kunar province, the 40-second window, where the only decision the situation offered was the decision she made, the 4 kilometers she carried him out of the contested area afterward, in the specific and irreversible knowledge of what his silence meant. What hit the room was the flatness of the delivery, the voice of someone who has said a thing so many times inside their own head that the words have worn smooth and no longer catch on the way out. When she finished, the room held its silence. Birch, 24 years old, 3 months back from his first deployment, said, "Did they want you to stand down afterward?" "They strongly recommended it. But you went back in. Within 72 hours. He pressed forward with the accidental directness of someone young enough to not yet understand what the question cost the person being asked. "Weren't you a liability? Emotionally, I mean, in that state?" 2 men on either side of him went rigid. Ingram did not receive it as an offense. She looked at Birch with the full attention she gave to any genuine question. "That's exactly the right thing to ask," she said. "The honest answer is that I don't know. My performance metrics on that operation were within normal parameters. Whether I was truly whole in there." She pressed her lips together once. "I've thought about that for 3 years. I still can't give you a certain answer." The admission hit the room harder than anything she demonstrated across 4 days of training. The willingness to sit in front of 7 soldiers and say, "I don't know whether I was broken in a way I couldn't measure." From a woman whose entire professional identity had been built on knowing exactly how functional she was and exactly how much she could carry, landed in each of them differently and completely. Strickland said, "Why are you telling us this?" She looked at him. "Because you're going back out, all of you. Another deployment, another theater, another set of rooms where the person beside you is the margin between a decision you can reverse and one you can't." She leaned forward slightly. "I need you to understand, not academically, not as doctrine. I need you to understand in your gut What it costs when ego enters that room with you. What it costs when you mistake your own certainty for correctness. A pause. Wilder didn't die because I was wrong. He died because the situation was wrong, and I was the person who had to move inside it. But I have spent 3 years asking myself whether a more disciplined version of me, a version without the blind spots I hadn't found yet, would have seen what I missed. Her voice stayed level. I don't want to be the story you tell each other about someone else's blind spots. I want you to find yours here, where the cost is discomfort instead of body bags. The twist arrived at 07:15 the next morning. Colonel Spence called Ingram into his office with the door half closed and the face of a man carrying news he hadn't asked to carry. Novak, passing in the corridor, stopped without meaning to. He heard 3 things. Spence said, "The inquiry has been escalated, Washington." Ingram was silent for 2 seconds. Then, "What are they claiming now?" Spence said, "Someone inside the intelligence architecture of the Kunar mission has come forward with an alternate account of the 40-second window. They're suggesting the decision you made was pre-planned. That Wilder's position was," he stopped, chose the next words with visible care, "that it was not accidental." The silence that followed was the longest 2 seconds Novak had stood still for in any corridor. Ingram's voice, when it came, was quieter than her normal voice, by a register that communicated more than volume ever could. "They're going to use him," she said. "They're going to use a man who cannot speak for himself to construct a narrative that has nothing to do with what actually happened in that valley." Novak didn't wait to hear Spence's answer. He walked back to the bunk room, sat on the edge of his rack, and started making phone calls. The final exercise was a full-scale night operation, all 5 days compressed into a single sequence, every rebuilt instinct tested at once in the dark. Strickland led the primary element. He made decisions that were clean and uncontaminated by ego, just assessed information and correct movement, one after the other. When the operation concluded and the opposing force coordinator, a senior SEAL instructor named Gideon, who'd run the scenario 41 times, said, "That approach, that's a solution I haven't seen before." Strickland said nothing. He looked at Ingram. She was already writing in her notebook. She didn't look up, but she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "You changed the frame." That night, Strickland found her sitting on the steps outside the main building. He sat down 2 feet away. The January cold was sharp, and the sky above Fort Bragg was the particular starless gray of a sky carrying too much light from below. "I'm sorry," he said, "not about the training, about the bar, about what I did." He turned the sentence over before finishing it. "I did it because you made me feel small, and I didn't know what to do with that except try to make you smaller. That's the honest version." She looked at the tree line. "Do you understand why that's a problem beyond the obvious?" she said. "Because of where I'm going, because of who'll be beside me when I get there. Because the reflex that reaches for someone smaller when you feel threatened," she said, "is the reflex that gets people killed, not the action, the thing underneath it." He sat with that after a long moment. The inquiry, what Novak heard through the door, "is not your burden to carry." "I disagree." He said it without challenge, just directly. "You spent 4 days making us understand that what happens to the person next to us is our business by definition." A pause. "I'm applying the lesson." She turned and looked at him for the first time since sitting down. Something shifted in her expression. Not the composed professional surface she wore most hours, but something underneath it. Something that had been under pressure for 3 years and was encountering unexpected resistance from a direction it hadn't anticipated. "Novak made calls," Strickland said. "He has a contact who knows people who were present at the post-mission review for Kunar. People who can speak to what the record actually contains. Those people have been quiet for 3 years. They were quiet because nobody asked them to be anything else." She looked back at the tree line, was still for a long moment. "Wilder would have despised this part," she said quietly. "The political machinery of it. He had no patience for bureaucratic revision. He used to say the only thing more useless than a bad decision was a committee trying to explain it after the fact." A pause. He was usually right about things like that. The next morning, Novak's contact confirmed 2 individuals present at the after-action review of the Kunar mission had independently provided sworn statements to a federal oversight office, not the inquiry, a separate office, corroborating the operational record as originally documented. A third statement was being finalized. The alternate account presented by the inquiry did not align with the documented record at any material point, and there were now people on record saying so, clearly, and under oath, in language that did not leave interpretive room. Ingram read the message. Novak handed her on a folded sheet of paper. She read it twice. She folded it and held it and looked out the window at the training ground. She said, "Wilder's daughter is 7 years old. Her name is Lily. She's going to grow up and one day be old enough to read her father's service record. She deserves for that record to be accurate." Another pause. "That's all. That's the only thing that matters about any of this." The debrief was at 0800. When Spence dismissed the group, Strickland lingered until the room was empty, except for Ingram, who was closing her notebook at the front table. He took something from his jacket pocket, an old challenge coin, the finish worn in the way of something carried daily for years. His grandfather's combat infantry badge coin, the one he'd had on him at the brickyard, the one he'd touched out of habit while sitting on the floor of that bar, trying to understand what had just happened to him. "My grandfather told me once that character isn't what you do when people are watching," Strickland said. "It's what you do with the weight when no one is." He kept his hand extended. "I haven't been doing much with the weight. I'd like you to hold this until I've given you a reason to think I mean that." Ingram looked at the coin. She looked at him. She took it, turned it once between her fingers, and placed it in the breast pocket of her jacket beside her notebook. "Then go be better," she said. "Not a wish, a requirement, delivered the way real requirements are delivered, without performance, without softness, in the clear and unambiguous language of someone who will hold you to it." Strickland nodded once and went to rejoin his squad. Ingram stood at the window of the empty briefing room for a while. She opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote one line, then capped her pen. Spence had offered her the permanent training position 3 weeks ago, and she hadn't answered yet. She'd driven to Fayetteville that Friday night, in part, because the silence of her Raleigh apartment had the quality of a held question she couldn't keep holding indefinitely. She thought about Wilder. She thought about Lily, who was 7, who would one day be old enough to search for her father's name and find whatever record the world had chosen to keep. She thought about what Wilder used to say on the long surveillance holds, in the hours when there was nothing to do but be still, and let the mind work itself through to something honest. The mission isn't the mission. The mission is the person beside you and the person beside them, and what they go home able to become. He said it differently each time. It always meant the same thing. She picked up her jacket and her notebook and walked down the corridor to Spence's office and knocked twice. When the door opened, she said, "I'll take the position." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, quietly, directly, without needing anyone to confirm it was the right call. That much she'd learned across 14 years in 4 countries and the 4 kilometers of silence that had redefined the word carry for her in a way it had never recovered from. Some weights don't lift. Some things you bring forward rather than put down. The work, the real work. The work that had nothing to do with any mission file or any inquiry or any coin left on a bar counter in the rain, was learning to carry the weight in a way that left your hands free. She still had work to do. She had always had work to do.